launch in, encourage a bit of chat, get them to tell you who they are, things like that.
Can I see how many people are coming in?
You can, if you click on participants.
Okay.
And we've got 17 already.
Okay. Yeah, 20. Hello, if you're joining us at the moment, do please, you're very welcome. I will start the talk in a moment. I'm just waiting for a few more people to join us. And do feel free to introduce yourselves to each other in the chat. I will have a look at that after the end of the talk and see who you are, and you're very welcome. Welcome if you're just joining us. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat function if you'd like to. We'll start the talk shortly, just waiting for a few more people to join us. I see one person has introduced themselves in the chat. If anybody else would like to do so, please feel free. We seem to have quite a multinational group of people already joining us. That's fantastic. You're extremely welcome. We will start the talk shortly when a few more people have joined the group. Quite a nice variety of different backgrounds and profiles. I'm not sure how many people are joining the group, but I can see that we've still got a few more coming in. So I will start shortly when we've given everybody an opportunity to join us. Good afternoon. If you're just joining us, a few people are introducing themselves in the chat. Just waiting to see if a few more people are coming in, and I will kick off shortly. Okay. I don't see any new people joining us at the moment, so in that case, I will kick off. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this talk at the Language Show this afternoon. Delighted to have so many of you already here. My name is Jocelyn Wybird. I'm the Director of the Language Centre at the University of Cambridge, and the title of my talk is Linguist or Global Graduate, a Matter of Identity. I will take questions at the end if that's okay, but you are welcome to post questions in the question area while I'm speaking, and I'll have a look at them at the end and take those. I don't know quite the full profile of all of you, but from what I've seen so far, there's quite a variety. I will be addressing mainly the context of the transition from studying languages at university, from being a university linguist, into a professional and employment context. However, if any of you are working as teachers in other sectors, I would hope that some of the messages around this will be of interest to you too, and also to those of you working in language professions or as students of languages. So off we go. I'm going to start with a scenario which is actually a true story that I heard, but I think it is something that happens actually more frequently than one might imagine. So graduating linguists at a university, going to a careers fair and talking to employers about possible opportunities for them to go into graduate employment. And a linguist was overheard at one stage saying, "What jobs do you have for linguists?" To which the answer was, "None. We outsource our translation requirements," from the employer. And I think what this demonstrates immediately is the crux of what this talk is going to be about, which is that the linguist is identifying as a linguist as a student, but the employer understands the word linguist in a completely different way to the way that the student is identifying themselves. But student linguists face other challenges when they're looking at moving into graduate employment. Frequently, they tell me, and I work in a university and I'm around students all the time, that they're very disappointed by the lack of vacancies in graduate schemes, which are asking specifically for language skills or for their language skills. So not seeing opportunities whereby they can use their high level of proficiency in French, German, Spanish, Russian, Chinese, Japanese, whatever language they've been studying, and therefore feeling that there's a mismatch between what they've studied and what employers seem to be looking for. So we have two different issues here when students are looking for employment, and I'm going to try and unpack some of those in the rest of this talk. Let's start with a very simple thing, which is the matter of identity as a student. When I'm talking to university students and I ask them who they are, what they're doing, etc., they will often self-identify in terms of being an economist, an engineer. I'm a historian, I'm a linguist, I'm a lawyer, I'm a medic, I'm a physicist. Now, these are identities while they are students, but clearly many of those are not necessarily the way that an employer would understand the identity of an individual. And I'll go on to that in a moment. And of course, as students graduate and they move into different careers, and so let's imagine the historian or a student of English or classics or any of the humanities and social sciences, even of many of the science students who decide not to stick in a specifically scientific type of career. If they were to go into a sector such as banking, regardless of their degree, they would actually become a trainee banker. So they would cease to be the historian, the student of English, the classicist, or whatever, and start to self-identify in terms of a new professional identity. So they might be training to become or be a PR executive, an accountant, an insurance executive, a journalist, a marketing executive, an account manager, a customer services manager. I mean, there are so many possible job titles, but we can see immediately that their professional identity is completely different to that by which they identified themselves as a student of a particular discipline while at university. There are, of course, certain identities which carry through from the university subject-based identity into a related profession. So a lawyer at university who decides to go into law as a sector may well identify themselves professionally as a lawyer, potentially with other subspecialisms such as a barrister or solicitor. An architect who actually goes on into architecture will potentially retain the title of architect in terms of their identity, their professional identity. And ditto an engineer. Or a doctor or surgeon might be related to having been a medic at university, but they might well identify themselves through their particular medical specialism once they've qualified. A physicist might still call themselves a physicist, but that depends on whether they're working specifically as a physicist, for example, as a research scientist or as an academic. And a linguist who goes into a language profession might well still identify themselves as a linguist professionally. I call myself a linguist because that is part of my professional identity. But broadly speaking, that is generally for translators, interpreters, teachers, academics, and so on. But it is not necessarily something that transfers for all linguists as students. Don't all become professional linguists. And this is part of the crux of that misunderstanding, if you like, that problem with that initial scenario that I spoke about, with the undergraduate linguist asking what jobs do you have for linguists, understood in a different sense in a professional context. All of those examples I've just given are characterized by further professional training or qualifications. Just simply an undergraduate degree is hardly ever sufficient for any of those professions. And that might include doing a master's or a doctorate studies. It might include other professional qualifications. For teachers, that might be a postgraduate certificate in education. For translators and interpreters, frequently they will do a master's in translating and interpreting, and they might also do other professional qualifications in diplomas as translators and so on. Architects will require a suite of professional qualifications, so will accountants, so will engineers. Simply from being an undergraduate engineer to being an engineer working in a large engineering company very rarely transfers without further studies or qualifications. And this is crucial, that the professional identity is very much that of a profession with its own qualifications, going way beyond undergraduate study in a particular discipline. Let's have a look a little bit at what is a linguist. Well, a student who might self-identify as linguist, they might be a student of a degree in languages and related language-based subjects as a specialist subject. Clearly, that includes also in joint honours degrees where you might be studying business and a language, or history and a language, or whatever else. But it is also potentially the term that a student of linguistics will use about themselves. And of course, that's highly distinct from being a student of languages and related subjects. Or it could be a student of any subject who also self-identifies as a linguist because of their multilingualism, which might be because they speak other languages at home and so on, they have acquired other languages along the way, or because they have taken language studies alongside their main degree. All of those people might self-identify as a linguist. The third one might have multiple identities, for example, as both an engineer and a linguist, or a historian and a linguist, etc. But professionally, it really includes the following professions. And as I said before, with additional qualifications, mainly translator, interpreter, teacher, an academic, a researcher in languages and linguistics at university level, could be a computational linguist, again, usually somebody who's gone through postgraduate studies in linguistics and looking at computational linguistics, who's looking at, who's working in the field of, for example, IT or artificial intelligence, which uses a lot of computational linguistic professions and so on. Potentially, there's a forensic linguist who's working with police or and investigations and so on of various different types. So there are a number of different types of linguist profession, but they are highly specific and highly professional, of course. Crucially, however, if we go back to a historian and get away from linguists for a moment, a historian would be unlikely to ask, what jobs do you have for historians, when talking to graduate employers in whatever sector. I've just put a few examples here. Unless, of course, potentially with postgraduate studies under their belt, they were looking for a job as an in-house historian in a particular organisation, quite a niche profession. But they wouldn't actually ask that same kind of question that perhaps our linguists are asking, and therefore wouldn't find themselves in that situation. What a historian would expect to do, somebody who has studied history at university, is to market themselves in terms of a wide range of transferable skills to graduate employers. And that is so particularly across the arts, humanities and social sciences, where there isn't necessarily a direct link between the subject of study at university and particular careers. And this is what linguists also need to do, unless, of course, they are pursuing through other qualifications and studies and so on, those opportunities that might exist for professional linguists. So linguists need to do this just as much as historians or students of English do. So where's the problem with this? Well, some research done by the British Academy called Born Global, and I can assure you that all of their research reports from the Born Global research are available on the British Academy's website. You just have to Google Born Global to find them. But their research, the report observed as a result of their research, by talking to employers, of course, and that's how they were informed, that language graduates were, compared to their peers, so let's imagine these historians or social scientists or students of English, often less capable of articulating the knowledge, skills, and attributes that they have acquired through their degree courses and how these may be relevant to future employers. Now, this is a worrying fact. I think perhaps there are reasons for that. Is it perhaps that linguists will focus too much on relying on their functional language skills, which, as we saw from the second scenario in the opening slide, they often find nobody is asking for proficiency at high level in German or whatever it is. So are they relying too much on functional language skills and their identity as linguists with insufficient focus on the wider attributes that, of course, those students of history, etc., have to turn to when marketing themselves to employers? And I suspect that this is very much the case from the research that has been done, including the Born Global research. So this is where I want to move us on to the concept of the global graduate, which is not a new concept, but it is quite useful to try and find aspects of definition of what is a global graduate. And a very, very useful report was published in 2011 by the National Council for Universities and Business here in the UK, called Global Graduates into Global Leaders. And what it did was that it came up with, from interviews with numerous employers who were looking for people who could help them, that they wanted to hire for their operations within a global economy, working globally as big businesses, etc. And they looked at the competencies they're looking for in what they might call the global graduate, who was fit to come and join their company in a global economy. And they came up with 14 competencies ranked by level of preference as a result of the research done with all of these employers. Multilingualism is, disappointingly for those of us linguists, only at number 11 out of 14, so quite low down the list. But let us not get disheartened. Let's have a look at what it is they're actually wanting. A couple of examples from higher up the list, but again, you can just Google global graduates into global leaders and you will find that report, and you can read all 14 of those competencies in order. But a couple of examples of them: an ability to embrace multiple perspectives and challenge thinking, an openness to and respect for a range of perspectives from around the world. That's just a couple of examples that come higher up the list than multilingualism per se. And several others incorporate cross-cultural and multicultural dimensions, as well as multicultural learning agility. And let's look at that. It's about thinking, what do these competencies mean? Because this is what they're looking for. Multilingualism is there, but it's as part of a much broader package. And what they did then in terms of publishing the report was that they gathered all of these 14 competencies into a framework, and they clustered them under some core headings. And you will see that those core headings are cultural agility on the left-hand side. This is actually the graphic from the report, but as it doesn't come out very well on the screen, I've spelt them out for you. So cultural agility, which is made up of empathy, sitting across the top there, resilience sitting here, and multilingualism. So we're pleased to see that multilingualism is indeed there. Then over here on the right-hand side, we've got global mindset with empathy, that crosses over, but multicultural knowledge and social etiquette. Then at the bottom, we have relationship management, comprising negotiating and influencing and leading teams. And all of these are underpinned by some core competencies the research identified, which are adaptability and learning agility. And all of those inform those other competencies. So this is quite an interesting framework to trying to define what is a global graduate and what is a global graduate made up of. Employers clearly want global graduates in a global economy. Whether it's the 2011 report or the Born Global research in 2016, both of these research reports included a number of quotes from businesses, and I've only selected a couple of them for you because you can read those reports yourselves, as I said, freely available online. So here is one report, one quote from an employer. Cultural dexterity is important, not to impose one's own culture on another one, to be sensitive to other cultures, and how to do business in different environments. They are looking for individuals who identify as boundaryless, able to move, shift, work anywhere and do anything. This is part of the agility. Business and context and international markets are changing constantly. And a lot of agility is needed. Which directions you're going to go in, which countries you might work in. This concept of being boundaryless, the mobile, able to move around and adjust is very, very important as part of the global graduate package. And from the Born Global research, quotes such as cultural agility is an essential attribute of the global graduate. Interesting on that, as they will be expected to work in multilingual and culturally diverse teams, face-to-face and virtually. Clearly, for the last 18 months, more virtually than face-to-face. But also the ability to approach a problem from multiple perspectives and to take into account different cultural expectations in finding solutions is key to effective transnational cooperation. So we can see that the Born Global research and the Global Graduates report are very much saying the same thing. But this is employers, this is big business saying this is what we want to see coming out of universities. And does that mean that language graduates are any of this? Well, the Born Global research also observed that the attributes of languages graduates go beyond technical linguistic skills. And remember that I suggested earlier that perhaps these graduates are relying overly on their profile as being linguists and having technical linguistic skills and not enough on everything else. So important though those undoubtedly are, but these attributes go even beyond intercultural understanding, embracing analytical rigor, resilience, the ability to communicate sensitively and subtly, and the maturity and independence which come from studying or working abroad. But remember that Born Global research also observed that language graduates were less good at talking about these wider attributes. So they've got them, but they're not actually showing them to employers. Instead, they're just talking about themselves in terms of having technical linguistic skills, having linguistic proficiency, and not going beyond that. So some key questions for us that arise from all of this, and which I'm hoping I will be answering during today's talk. Can you be a global graduate without being a linguist? Well, we saw multilingualism was there, but ranked at a number 11. It is there. Can you be a global graduate if you're not a linguist? Good question. How can being a linguist make you a better global graduate is another way of looking at it. And even controversially, is being a linguist actually essential to being a global graduate, even though it doesn't appear as such from some of that research? Well, I've got my own views on that, and I'm sure you can guess what some of them are. But anyway, on we go. So if we look at, again, at the global graduate framework for employers, which we've looked at already, then the key question for us is, how does a university student of any subject become a global graduate? What I have tried to do, and I've mapped these competencies onto experiences at university, is come up with some answers. And some of those answers are inevitably skewed for linguists, but let's start. So we had the headings of cultural agility was the first one, broken down into resilience and multilingualism. Well, I think a lot of resilience is built by residents abroad. So students who have moved to go and study in different universities, whether coming to the UK to study from abroad or British students who have gone abroad, for example. Coping with all sorts of challenges in studies and personal life can build resilience. Any student might go through those. Working and studying and living with people of different cultures, whether at home or abroad. And remember that British universities are extremely international environments these days. So that can all build resilience, amongst other things. Navigating different ways of thinking, living and being by being away at university, for example, but also in a number of different contexts can help to build resilience. Multilingualism, of course, through language degrees, through language learning alongside other studies, through institution-wide language programs at university, for example. language acquisition while abroad, while living in another country for whatever purpose, while visiting other countries and so on. Or active use of heritage languages or having a bilingual background. But also that multilingualism is infinitely enhanced if in the process you reflect on and contrast different ways of communicating across different languages and cultures. How about global mindset, which was the second of the overarching headings? Well, that was broken into multicultural knowledge, which can come from studying literature, culture, history, philosophy, politics, society, religions, economics, etc., from wider perspectives. So breaking away in the UK context from Anglo-centric norms, but actually studying the ways of thinking and other cultures through various different outputs. Contrasting perspectives from different cultural traditions as part of those studies, for example. Multicultural and cultural learning that is involved in residence abroad, what you learn about other cultures through that immersive experience in another country, for example, or of course, around people of different cultures where you live at home. What about social etiquette? Well, building sensitivity to contrastive norms of behavior and a willingness to adapt is all part of social etiquette, of acquiring that kind of etiquette. And that could be in all sorts of contexts at university and working. Perhaps studying communication styles as part of your studies in linguistics or languages can actually improve social etiquette as well. Studying contrastive rhetorical traditions and discourse analysis in first and second languages, and noticing how in different cultural traditions and different linguistic traditions, there are different approaches to conveying information and different forms of nicety and levels of politeness or register. Critically observing behavioral norms when abroad or in a multicultural context can also enhance all of that. And online etiquette, of course, in multicultural communications is absolutely crucial as well. What about relationship management? Well, negotiating and influencing was the first of those, and all sorts of communication skills gained during university studies could be through project work, through language classes and other things that will actually help with negotiating and influencing. What about working on group projects in student work, teamwork at university, work placements, internships, and so on? What about sports and student societies, debating, all sorts of extracurricular activities? And all of these could be gained in multicultural and multilingual contexts at home and during residence abroad, which would enhance those negotiating and influencing skills. But also navigating online learning and social spaces requires all of that. Leading teams, well, quite often through work placements and internships, people will have the chance to be in teams, whether to the extent to which they have the chance to lead teams will vary enormously, but potentially university project work does that as well. But also student societies and sports give those opportunities. And a lot of that is, of course, for further development in employment and could be aspirational for new graduates. Empathy, as we saw, crossed over into a couple of those domains. But empathy can be built up in a number of ways that are already pretty much covered, such as living, working, studying alongside others from diverse backgrounds, whether at home and abroad. And of course, building awareness of other perspectives helps you then to have greater empathy for other ways of looking at the world. And building rapport by developing respect for and understanding of diversity and otherness. Core competencies then, learner agility, and adaptability. Well, learning new or extended skills, such as taking language courses alongside other subjects, is part of learner agility, as is learning in unfamiliar contexts, such as learning abroad, learning in multicultural groups through the medium of a second language, developing new skills and behaviours in response to diverse contexts. What about adaptability? Adapting to different contexts through residence abroad. I think some of this, frankly, is actually quite obvious to many of us, but it's actually about finding a framework and then thinking for all students, how do they fit that framework? How have they developed those attributes? my view, only linguists develop all of these competencies as part of their languages degrees or through the study of languages alongside other degrees, because they've got the multilingualism, but also the enhanced communication skills and cross-cultural understanding that comes from having linguistic and communication sensitivity. But particularly, as we saw from many of the examples I gave, if that has been accompanied by periods of work or study abroad, for which language skills are almost always essential. So I would argue that pretty much all of these competencies can be gained by linguists, and many of them will gain most of them. But a lot of non-linguists will find it hard to gain all of those global graduate competencies. The Born Global research I mentioned earlier made some observations. These wider skills, the ones that we've been talking about, which may not be specific to language degree study, but which are certainly strong features of it, may be underappreciated as among the benefits of language degrees, even by languages students and graduates and by their teachers. And we've seen examples of how underappreciated they are from other research observations. And there was also an observation in Born Global report, which was that unless there was a direct request for language competence, language graduates tended to convey the perception that they did not have the confidence or possess the generic skills to apply for general graduate posts. I bet they have got these skills, they just don't know how to express them. And this is where this framework is terribly important. I want briefly to visit the issue of global English, because so many people say that in a world of global English, other languages are not necessary. So therefore, it is not necessary for a global graduate also to be a linguist. There is a lot of research going on into the phenomenon of English as a global lingua franca, often known as ELF. Don't confuse it with EFL, which is English as a foreign language. This is English as a lingua franca, which has actually looked at the fact that it's a vehicle for communication between numerous different cultures, and that actually can include contexts in which no English speakers are actually represented. So, for example, Germans speaking to Japanese, or a multinational meeting which happens not to have any Americans, Australians, Irish, English people present. And that means that ELF is actually developing along diverse linguistic norms so as to be as effective as a vehicle for communication between non-native language speakers without necessarily English speakers alongside. The problem is that a lot of English native speakers will pepper their language with culturally rich references and idioms, and or fail to adapt phonetically or lexicogrammatically to the ELF environment they find themselves in. And as researchers have observed, as far as intercultural competencies and strategies are concerned, native speakers are frequently disadvantaged due to their lack of practice in these processes. So this is also the processes of adapting phonetically or lexicogrammatically, and over-reliance on English as their first language. So they're not adapting. And Jenkins, in a book called Languages After Brexit, there's a chapter by Jenkins on the problem with English, actually talks about how successful communication in English lingua franca context can work. She says, transcultural communication skills are paramount. More successful ELF communicators will be able to adjust or accommodate their own use of English and other languages so as to make it more appropriate for their interlocutors, and their own receptive expectations so as to more easily understand what is being said to them. The process of having learnt another language or languages, she goes on to say, is helpful in being understood by alerting speakers to what kinds of linguistic features non-native speakers may find difficult to understand in English. And many English speakers lack both these skill sets. And this is an issue. Those who are monolingual will increasingly find themselves left behind in supposedly English interactions in which their conversation partners translanguage in and out of other languages. She even provides an example from another academic, from another researcher. So a context, and this is of course the past tense now that Brexit has happened, but EU meetings in the past in which speakers of diverse nationalities choose to speak in English with few listening to the interpreters in their headphones. But the moment a British or Irish participant takes the floor, you can often notice that some participants suddenly grab their earphones and start fiddling with the channel selector. In other words, they can understand each other speaking English, but not the native speakers without need for an interpreter. That is a salutary lesson for us native English speakers. So to summarize what I've talked about today, a linguist is not automatically a global graduate, but multilingualism is part of that profile. But of course, like linguists, by virtue of being linguists, do gain a lot of other aspects of that profile. They just need to be able to talk about that and describe them. A global graduate has a range of competencies which go beyond the linguistic, but are crucially byproducts of language studies, as well as many of those attributes being byproducts of studies in other disciplines. Linguists or multilingual students are more likely to be able to develop the intercultural communication skills required of global graduates, even in English lingua franca contexts. And that was the final point I was making. And just to remind you, a linguist in a professional context does not have the same meaning as when used about an individual or a student's personal identity. So it needs to be used in a new way. So my conclusion, therefore, is that a global graduate must also, therefore, be a linguist. And a linguist, when transitioning from study to employment, needs to redefine their identity as a global graduate. That's the end of the formal part of the talk. I'm just putting up some further reading that you might find interesting. So firstly, the global research I've mentioned a lot. You just look for it on the British Academy website. The Global Graduates into Global Leaders report is on the NCUB website. Languages After Brexit is a book. I'm afraid that needs purchasing or seeking out. How the UK Speaks to the World is absolutely superb book with a whole range of different chapters in there, which you might find interesting. I have written a much longer version of what I've just told you about as a chapter in a book, which is available in open access. It's a published book, but it's available online in open access. So if you were to look for linguist or global graduate, a matter of identity, and Google that, you should be able to find my chapter within a book published by researchpublishing.net online. And there is also another one called Transnational Graduates and Employability that I wrote previously, also available from Research Publishing Net. So I'm going to go to the question and answer, and I don't see any open questions in the Q&A, but I'm going to go into the chat instead and just see if, but there is so much in the chat, I'm not too sure if I'm going to find any. But if anybody has questions, would you like to actually post them into the Q&A rather than into the chat? There is a question and answer place where you can post questions. Not seeing any at the moment. I'll go into the chat and just see if there is anything. I can see a couple of thanks. Oh, well, lots of comments about Brexit and so on, which is not surprising. But I'm not seeing any questions actually in the Q&A. So, but please do put one into the Q&A. Okay, so somebody said employer most of the time seek written proof of formal education and do not appreciate the real knowledge and skills. Judging just by the academic education is not good. I think I would agree with that. There may be people who do not have formal academic education, and they're still far better at communication, have better language skills than their employers. I think the point with this is that when people are applying for jobs, they need not only to cite what their formal education and qualifications are, but also, crucially, to talk about the other attributes that they have, which you have an opportunity to do in cover letters for employment and things, cross-referencing to how you have gained those attributes through different forms of experience, etc. Can I be a global graduate without formal academic education and a grade? Well, the concept of a global graduate is used about somebody who has a university degree, because employers often talk about graduate employment and the kinds of roles that they will employ people for where they expect someone to be educated to degree level. But you can, of course, characterize yourself as having the full set of global competencies, but your question then would be whether we're looking at employers who will employ you without a degree, which of course many of them do for all sorts of things. So I think the notion of those global competencies that we talked about are just as relevant to you if you are not a graduate. You believe that the British Academy and UCML are reviewing higher education, modern foreign languages together. Well, there are always reviews going on all the time, Richard. So yes, and the descriptors of what a language degree is about are always up for review by the Quality Assurance Agency. And in fact, my previous article, the one that's at the bottom of the slide there, on transnational graduates, was looking at actually how the descriptors of higher education modern foreign language degrees match against what employers are actually looking for. But as far as their broader remit, I'm not actually currently involved with either the British Academy or UCML at the moment. Another question, do you think it would also help students and graduates of employers who are multinational, you can speak more about the challenges they face when they don't have staff in their workforce that speak languages? This may help students to see the value of their skills through the eye of an employer. Of course it would be helpful, but we can't actually force employers to give those messages. What we can do, though, is look at the kind of research, such as the Born Global research and, of course, the Global Graduates into Global Leaders reports, which cite what employers are asking for. And if they're asking for these skills, it's because they will help them face those challenges. And where do you fall into learning business language in another language, given the topic of not focusing on just promoting the academic side of language? I'm not entirely certain what you mean. I mean, clearly business language is very important. And if you've got language competence, then learning to use that in a business context is terribly important. And you may well end up using your language skills in business. Don't misunderstand me that I'm saying that your technical language skills aren't important. They are important, and you may well find yourself using those in your employment. But I think if you're too narrow-minded in your approach and going, all I have to offer is my language skills, I don't have anything else, you're not going to find the roles where they are looking for this broader set of competencies. But ditto, if you are only looking for jobs which ask for your own language skills, you may not find that there are jobs out there. So it's about valuing your language skills, absolutely, but seeing them as part of a broader category. I think our time is probably up, and the webinar may indeed close shortly, or I should actually probably close it for us. So what I'd like to do is thank you all very, very much for attending and for being here this afternoon. It has been fantastic to speak to you, and I hope you found something of interest to inspire you, which you may also go on and read more about, and it may help you in your career. So thank you very, very much indeed for being here today, and goodbye.